Silence breathed from the pit below, a foul, warm sigh of quiet that laid heavy on Detective Edwin Hayes. Perhaps it was the gasp of a world violated, or the wordless extol of terrible things living, smiling in the void beneath. Regardless of its cause, silence was the mere antecedent of his doom. Death was a sudden snicker in the void, a restrained glee whistling through a gate of teeth, a familiar voice whispering, "Welcome, Mr. Hayes. I'm glad you came." When Detective Hayes arrived at Frontier Apartments 2 years ago, he knew it was the prelude to a much longer, bloodier proclamation. All the signs were there, minutial details laid bare like breadcrumbs, the artful balance of whimsy and restraint, the careful poise of the main exhibition. A girl, divorced of all her limbs and then remarried to them masterfully through a series of interconnected, crimson-stained strings. She had been made into a marionette, of course, an abandoned shell left to mock the bright spirit it once seated. More dummies followed, vacant people-shaped houses, their lights snuffed out, dangling from doorways, church steeples, and tree limbs. The only lead he had was the phone call that preceded every murder, a blithesome voice offering the location of a newly crafted doll. The killer couldn't help a bit of self-indulgence, of course, as every act of phoned-in charity was ended with his favorite idiom, "no strings attached." But despite the detective's eagerness to catch the smarmy murderer, he couldn't assemble the puzzle before him, at least, not as easily as the killer could his jigsaws of dismembered playthings. It was only a couple weeks ago that a bizarre series of events signaled the next act in the Geppetto killer's tour de force. All his victims' bodies disappeared. Each one was torn from its resting place, whether it be his most recent victim from the steel slab of the morgue, or from the gravesite of his first. They were all gone. It wasn't long after that Detective Hayes received a phone call offering him a chance to apprehend his boogeyman. He need only go to the Kinderman Woods, alone. "No strings attached," the voice assured. The trees of the Kinderman Woods shed a canopy of shadowy doppelgangers on the ground where Detective Hayes walked, his every step blackened by their doleful cast. He knew he arrived at the right place when he reached the lip of a yawning abyss, above which dangled all 17 of Geppetto's puppets. But the detective noticed something strange. The strings by which they all hung were not attached to the looming branches overhead, but stretched endless into the midnight above. The doll-like bodies suddenly all danced and sang, their ambulant figures slowly lowering into the chasm below. Rigger grins and cheery melodies drowned in the swallowing oblivion until, at last, silence was the detective's only companion. That is, until he heard the putrid sweetness of a familiar voice.
"Welcome, Mr. Hayes. I'm glad you came."
A man ascended from the blackness below, hoisted up by thin fingers of string dripping from the moon-swept sky above. He plopped down in front of the detective awkwardly, like a puppet trying to gain its footing. A knife shined in his hands.
"We all parrot the movements of free things, Detective, but in truth, we are beholden to the whimsy of greater, terrible powers. The result is a pantomimed life, an existence scripted by the fingers that cruelly tether us to them. But my master is a merciful one, Detective, one who is open to propositions rather than prayers."
The man-puppet took a step closer.
"I was presented a task, you see, offered brief bouts of liberation to deliver my master some much-wanted company. When I finally asked what I might receive in return, well..."
The blade in the murderous marionette's hand suddenly plunged into Detective Hayes' chest, and the sound of strings suddenly snapping echoed into the dark forestry beyond. The killer leaned into Hayes' ears and finished his story.
"Freedom," my master said. "No strings attached."